We tend to think of evil as something distant, something that happens out there, committed by monsters who are nothing like us. It's easy to imagine evil as a sudden transformation. One day someone is good, and the next day they are a monster. But in reality, evil usually enters the world through small, almost invisible steps. Tiny compromises, rationalizations, and moral shortcuts that snowball over time. This is what the philosopher Hannah Arendt referred to as the banality of evil after observing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key figures behind the Holocaust. Arendt was struck by how disturbingly normal Eichmann seemed. He wasn't a raving ideologue or a violent sadist. He was a bureaucrat, calmly insisting that he was simply doing his job. Eichmann wasn't driven by fanatic hatred, but by obedience and a slow detachment from the consequences of his actions. When he signed orders to transport millions of Jews to their deaths, he didn't see it as mass murder. He saw it as paperwork. He didn't see the individuals he was condemning. He saw quotas and numbers. This is the insidious nature of evil. It can sneak in through mundane acts until we don't even recognize what we've become, a story of just doing a job. Many involved in the Nazi regime were, like Eichmann, regular people fulfilling bureaucratic duties, or soldiers just following orders. They didn't start out as killers. They were swept into a system that systematically chipped away at their moral beliefs until they could justify the unthinkable. As they did, their humanity eroded, and what was once unacceptable became routine. In modern times, this idea continues. Think about corporate environments where unethical practices are normalized. Someone might start by simply turning a blind eye to unfair policies, but over time, they become complicit in much larger wrongdoings. It could be insider trading, exploitation of labor, or even environmental destruction. It's not about inherently evil intentions. It's about how systems can normalize behavior that leads to harmful outcomes. Fear is an overwhelming force, capable of stripping away our values and sense of right and wrong in a moment. Fear can take many forms. Fear for our lives, fear of the unknown, fear of losing power or status, and even fear of punishment. When we are afraid, we stop thinking rationally, and morality often becomes a luxury we can't afford. Consider the infamous case of Unit 731 in Japan during World War II. The soldiers and doctors who worked in Unit 731 carried out horrifying biological and chemical experiments on prisoners, often dismembering or killing them in the process. These atrocities were done in the name of science and military progress. But how did these men justify such horrific acts? For many, it was out of fear for their own lives and loyalty to authority. Soldiers were indoctrinated with the belief that their nation's survival depended on these experiments. The fear of being seen as weak, unpatriotic, or disloyal led them to commit atrocities they might have otherwise refused. On a smaller, more relatable scale, think about times when you've done something out of fear. Maybe you kept quiet when someone was being bullied, or followed along with a group decision that you knew was wrong. Fear of standing out or being targeted can push us to sacrifice our morals. Fear and desperation in survival situations. Look at survival situations, like the infamous story of the Donner Party. In 1846, a group of American pioneers got trapped in the Sierra Nevada during a harsh winter. Starving, freezing, and isolated, they resorted to cannibalism to survive. It's easy to judge from a distance, but these weren't inherently evil people. They were desperate, facing certain death unless they took extreme measures. Fear of starvation, fear for their very lives, led them to do something unthinkable under normal circumstances. The line between right and wrong dissolves when we face life-threatening fear. Dehumanization is a powerful psychological weapon. When people stop seeing others as fully human, the mental barriers to cruelty, abuse, and even murder fall away. It's much easier to inflict harm on someone when you convince yourself that they are less than human. Take the case of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Over a period of just 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsis were killed by Hutu extremists. One of the key factors that allowed this massacre to unfold was the widespread dehumanization of the Tutsi people. Government propaganda compared the Tutsis to cockroaches, a metaphor that stripped them of their humanity. Once someone is viewed as an insect, exterminating them no longer feels like a moral dilemma. It becomes an act of cleansing. We see this process of dehumanization in countless atrocities throughout history. During the Nanking Massacre in 1937, Japanese soldiers systematically dehumanized Chinese civilians, seeing them as subhuman enemies who deserved to be brutalized. The result? Tens of thousands of rapes, murders, and acts of torture. Dehumanization makes it possible for ordinary people to commit acts of extraordinary evil because it allows them to detach emotionally from the suffering they cause. Dehumanization isn't just a tool of war or genocide. It happens in everyday life. Think about how easy it is to insult someone on social media, how people can mock, ridicule, and bully others online. The anonymity and detachment of the internet make it easier to forget that there are real people with real feelings on the other side of the screen. When we reduce others to avatars, usernames, or opposing political identities, we dehumanize them. And that can lead to justifying cruelty. One of the most famous psychological studies of all time, Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment, reveals how powerful authority can be in leading people to commit evil acts. Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary Germans could have participated in the atrocities of the Holocaust. His experiment involved participants administering what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person, an actor, whenever they made a mistake in a memory task. Despite hearing the actors scream in pain and beg for the shocks to stop, most participants continued to deliver shocks simply because the authority figure, a researcher in a white lab coat, insisted the experiment must continue. A staggering 65% of participants were willing to deliver what they believed to be lethal shocks, simply because an authority figure told them to. This shows how easily people can surrender their personal morality when faced with pressure from authority. This wasn't just an isolated experiment. The same dynamics are at play in real-life horrors. In Nazi Germany, millions of soldiers and civilians followed orders that led to the murder of millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, and others deemed undesirable. Many of them were not ideological zealots. They were simply following orders. The same justification echoed through the trials of the guards at Abu Ghraib during the Iraq War, where prisoners were brutally tortured and humiliated. Soldiers said they were following the directives of their superiors. When we relinquish personal responsibility to authority, we open the door to evil. Humans are social creatures. We are wired to belong, to fit in, and to be accepted by our group. This instinct is so strong that we can often suppress our personal morality to align with the beliefs or actions of the group. This is the phenomenon known as groupthink. One of the most horrific examples of groupthink is the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War. In 1968, a company of American soldiers entered the village of My Lai and, over the course of several hours, killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. Many of these soldiers had never committed an act of violence like this before. So how did this happen? The pressure to conform, to follow the orders of their superiors, and the group dynamic of war fueled the massacre. When one person in the group acts, others follow, losing sight of their own moral compass. This isn't just a problem in military or war settings. Groupthink can happen in everyday life, in workplaces, schools, and communities. How often have you gone along with something just because everyone else was doing it? How often have you silenced your objections to fit in with the crowd? Peer pressure can make people act in ways they would never consider on their own. And when combined with a band or violent group dynamic, it can lead to atrocities. One of the most disturbing aspects of evil is that many people who commit it believe they are doing the right thing. This is where self-justification comes into play. People will go to great lengths to avoid feeling like they are in the wrong. When our actions clash with our values, we experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. To resolve this discomfort, we often change our beliefs or rationalize our behavior so that it aligns with our actions. Take, for example, the case of Anders Breivik, the Norwegian far-right extremist who killed 77 people in 2011. Breivik did not see himself as a murderer. In his mind, he was a crusader defending Europe from multiculturalism and the supposed dangers of immigration. He justified his horrific actions as necessary for a greater good, despite the immense suffering he caused. Or, consider the American doctors involved in the Tuskegee syphilis study who deliberately left African American men untreated for syphilis for decades. These men suffered and died without knowing they were part of an experiment. How did the doctors justify this? They convinced themselves they were doing it for the greater good of scientific research, even as people died. This process of self-justification is deeply embedded in human psychology. It allows people to commit horrific acts while still seeing themselves as good, moral individuals. Understanding the complex, multifaceted process by which ordinary people become capable of committing evil acts forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature. We all have the potential to do harm if the circumstances align in the right or wrong way. So how do we prevent evil? First, we must become more aware of the psychological mechanisms that lead to evil, such as dehumanization, fear, obedience to authority, and groupthink, so that we can recognize when they are at play in our own lives. We must learn to question authority, to think critically and independently, and to stand up against group pressure, even when it feels uncomfortable. Second, we must foster empathy and compassion, both in ourselves and in our communities. The more we can see others as fully human, the harder it becomes to harm them. Dehumanization thrives when we stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as stereotypes or threats. By fostering empathy, we can resist the forces that push us toward cruelty.